For as long as maps had blank spaces, the North Pole had been the crown jewel of relentless human fascination, untouched, unknown, and almost otherworldly. This frozen edge of the world had driven explorers to launch daring expeditions just for the chance to be the first person to stand where no one else ever had. Starting as a race for exploration, then turned into a scramble for bragging rights. This frantic struggle to conquer the North Pole had quietly turned into a ruthless contest of national pride for many nations by the late 1800s. Norwegians, followed by the Britons, and then the Americans, were all racing, desperate to outdo, outpace, and outlast the other. The results of those races, though, never bore fruit, even in success. Fortunes were poured into dead ends. Resources were stretched thin, and above all, lives upon lives were lost in an environment so extreme and brutal it could test the sanity of human minds and make them do things no one could possibly imagine. On July 7, 1881, a U.S. crew of 25 men set sail towards the North Pole on a strange and fateful mission that, unbeknownst to them, would spiral into one of the most harrowing ordeals in Arctic history and leave them stained with accusations of butchering and devouring their dead comrades for survival. This is their story. In 1875, the Austro-Hungarian explorer and naval officer Karl Weipert came up with a proposal to bring together an international effort to study the polar regions by establishing simultaneous scientific stations as close to the poles as possible. He called it the International Polar Year. The whole idea was to get multiple countries to participate and share their data so it wouldn't just speed up scientific progress, but also help ease the competition. Unfortunately, Karl didn't live long enough to see his vision come to fruition. But 7 years after he first pitched the idea, it finally came to life. The first International Polar Year was officially launched, with 12 countries actively participating, including the United States, which agreed to send its own research team to establish an Arctic station near the North Pole. But there was one big problem. While the whole thing looked good on paper, getting Congress to actually approve funding for it was a very different story. It was hard to sell the idea of spending money on something that was just research, especially when most of the congressmen were way more excited about reaching the North Poles first for national glory, rather than backing a quiet scientific mission that, in their opinion, wasn't going to grab any headlines. So to get the kind of backing they needed, the expeditions had to promise that chasing the North Pole was one of their main goals, right up there with all the scientific work. It was a strategic move, tapping into national pride to secure the funding they needed. But the reality was, these missions weren't designed purely as polar races. So most of the crew, even those from the military, weren't survival experts. They were scientists, researchers, and people trained to take measurements, collect data, and write reports. Not individuals prepared to power through brutal Arctic conditions and make life or death choices along the way. 24 of such men, most of whom were members of the Weather Bureau of the U.S. Army Signal Corps, were put together under the leadership of Lieutenant Adolphus Washington Greely to form the American Expedition to the North Pole as part of the first International Polar Year, officially called the Lady Franklin Bay Expedition, or more commonly, the Greely Expedition. The expedition had 3 main goals. First and foremost, they were supposed to establish a meteorological observation station and collect astronomical, magnetic, and other scientific observatory data from the North Pole region. Apart from that, they were instructed to search for any possible wreckage or clues from the lost steamship USS Jeannette, which had disappeared in the Arctic 2 years earlier. And last but not least, and probably the one that had the most eyes on it, was to attempt to reach the North Pole itself, or at least break the long-standing record previously held by the British explorers. The vessel used for the mission was a 68-meter-long, 467-ton steam-powered whaling ship called Proteus, which had been refitted specifically to handle the Arctic waters. But unlike a typical expedition heading north, or pretty much anywhere else, Proteus wasn't supposed to carry Greely and his men all the way through and then bring them back. Instead, the plan was to drop them off on the Lady Franklin Bay waterway, return the following year with more supplies, and then return again in the third year to pick them up and officially conclude the expedition. The reason behind this strategy had a lot to do with the fact that Greely and his team weren't just there to explore, they were tasked with setting up a research station, which made this a different kind of mission compared to the usual expeditions. But beyond that, there was another factor. Greely actually saw the ship as more of a liability than an asset. He believed that if the men stayed too tied to the vessel, they'd start relying on it too much, which would make them soft, less willing to work hard, and overall not perform to the level he expected from them. Apart from that, even though Greely had no experience with Arctic conditions, he had more than enough confidence in his authority, and with no ship around, his men would have no choice but to stay put and follow his lead. At exactly 12:15 p.m., Greely and his 25 men set sail on Proteus from St. John's under clear skies and fine weather. The conditions they'd soon run into were some of the finest and most unexpected for a trip heading that far north. Before setting off, Greely and his team had braced themselves for the worst. The forecasts warned of severe weather, strong currents, and most of all, heavy packed ice waiting for them near the final stretch of their journey. And this wasn't just speculation. They had also spoken to a few whalers who'd passed through that same stretch of ocean around this time of year. According to them, the ice would be thick enough to seriously damage the ship if they weren't extremely cautious. But in the next 36 days of their journey, there were no violent waves, no stormy skies, and not a single trace of the pack ice they had been warned about. Everything stayed smooth, quiet, and strangely calm. It was inviting, maybe even a little too much, but at that time, Greely and his men wouldn't notice anything unusual about it. Feeling confident and full of energy, the men arrived at Lady Franklin Bay on August 11, 1881, about 965 kilometers from the North Pole, and immediately got to work unloading 350 tons of supplies from Proteus. These supplies were meant to last them more than a year before another batch would arrive. Once everything was offloaded, Proteus turned around and headed back, leaving the team on their own for at least the next 12 months, or so they thought at the time. Greely didn't waste any time getting the men organized, putting them to work building their research station out of the prefabricated sections they had brought along. It was kind of like putting together a giant Lego set with the pieces already made so they didn't have to start from scratch. Even so, the harsh Arctic conditions made it a tough job, but once the station was finally standing, the crew named it Fort Conger and moved in to begin establishing their base operations. Everyone had a role to play, and teams began heading out on day-long trips into the frozen wilderness, gathering valuable data on weather patterns, scientific measurements, and meteorological observations. The first couple of months went really well. The team was excited and optimistic, with good weather on their side and early success in their research. But then, the first dark chapter of their journey began. The winter of 1881 arrived early, in October. Part of the polar circle areas around the North Pole experience days and nights that can last for months on end. After 5 straight months of non-stop daylight, October 15th marked the last time the sun would rise over Lady Franklin Bay for the next 137 days. From that point on, the expedition would be swallowed by blinding darkness, on top of the already punishing winter conditions that were just starting to kick in. As those long, sunless days dragged on, the cold deepened into something almost unnatural. The temperature dropped to a staggering negative 46.6 degrees Celsius and just kept sinking. The wind didn't blow. It slashed, ripping through layers like they weren't even there. Snow hardened into crusted slabs, and even the walls of Fort Conger creaked and groaned at night, like the wood itself was shivering. At these temperatures, the world changes its rules. Urine would freeze mid-air, turning to brittle yellow shards before ever touching the ground. Breath would come out in thick clouds that crystallized instantly, coating scarves and mustaches. Skin left exposed for even a minute would redden, go numb, and then burn with an unsettling pain that felt like it came from the inside out. Ink froze in pens, and eyelids stiffened with frost. This wasn't just weather, it was a slow, creeping siege. Still, Greely and his men tried to hold their ground. They kept themselves busy with whatever they could, celebrating occasions, coming together, and even organizing contests like running or shooting matches. Winners would get little luxury rewards, things like a bit of tobacco or a sip of rum, just enough to lift their spirits for the moment. But nothing they did could really cut through the weight of that relentless, soul-crushing weather. And on top of that, Greely had this constant need to keep things running by the book. He enforced protocols, even when they seemed pointless, just to maintain order and remind everyone who was in charge. Every day, no matter how brutal the conditions outside, the crew had to go out and collect data. 500 different readings on things like weather, barometric pressures, wind speeds, magnetism, and more. And even when they weren't doing that, Greely wouldn't let them lie down during the day. He'd assign duties, check up on everything personally, and expect everything to be done just right. The men would sit stiffly on benches all day long, and as the cold grew worse, so did their resentment for him. Greely, for his part, wasn't any easier. Actually, the more the men turned against him, the more aggressively he reacted, often over the smallest things, just to make sure discipline was being kept up. One day, some of the cavalrymen refused to take over the laundry duties from Greely, and the young captain got so angry that he called everyone together and gave them a long, intense speech. He made it clear he wasn't someone to be messed with, and warned that if he saw any breach of discipline against his orders, he wouldn't hesitate to do whatever it took, even if it meant risking lives to keep control. A statement like that, over something as small as laundry, only made the crew's hatred toward him grow stronger. They all knew he was acting out of ego and a fear of losing his grip on authority, but at that point, there wasn't much they could do. Slowly and painfully, the blinding winter finally passed, and the sun rose again in March of the new year. With the sunlight reaching them, the tense atmosphere eased up a bit, and Greely set the men on their next task. They had to beat the British record for reaching the farthest north, or, if they were lucky, actually reach the North Pole themselves. No matter how much they focused on research, the men all knew the real glory was in this challenge. Whoever pulled it off would become the most talked about explorer of the time, and that meant bigger rewards, both from the government and in history. So naturally, everyone wanted to be picked for the attempt. Greely, however, decided to split them into separate teams and make them compete against each other. The first team was led by the expedition physician, Dr. Octave Pavey, while the other was led by Lieutenant James Booth Lockwood, who was second in command after Greely, along with the first sergeant, David Legge Brainard. Both teams set out on sled expeditions from different sides of the Franklin Bay shore on March 19, 1882. Dr. Pavey led his team along the Ellesmere Island coast on the northwestern side of Fort Conger, while James and David took a slightly unconventional route, heading east from the Greenland side. 4 weeks into their brutal march across the Arctic wasteland, through bone-cracking winds and endless whiteouts, both teams had progressed quite far, and Dr. Pavey and his group were about to reach the farthest north location. But all of a sudden, a dangerous ice pack stopped their sleds dead in their tracks, and they had no choice but to return, falling heartbreakingly short of a breakthrough that would have rewritten the record books. Meanwhile, James and David, trailing behind with their team, pushed forward at a crawling pace. The terrain they were facing was no less of a nightmare either, but they kept pushing, and after 4 more weeks, on May 13th, they finally made it to 83 degrees, 23 minutes, and 8 seconds, setting a new world record for the farthest point north a human had been, beating the previous one by 4 miles. And for the first time ever, Americans took that title from the British, who'd held it since 1607. James and David, leading their worn but proud crew, marched back into Fort Conger on July 1st, victorious. The place lit up. The energy was electric, and after a year of brutal cold, bone-deep exhaustion, and back-breaking orders, they'd not only survived, but made real progress in both research and their push towards the North Pole. And with the resupply ship due any day, bringing fresh supplies, new faces, letters from home, and a long-awaited change in command, everyone was ready to exhale. The worst, it seemed, was behind them. It felt like the perfect ending. So they waited, eyes scanning the ice for the Proteus. One day, two, a week, spirits were still high. They laughed it off. Ships run late. But then the days kept stacking. Weeks turned into a month. Then two. Jokes got quieter, smiles faded. Summer drained away, and with it, their hope. Winter crept in. The sun vanished beneath the horizon once again, gone for the next 5 months. Some of the men climbed the cliffs nearby to look for the ship coming from a distance, but there was still no sign, no message, just endless, empty horizon. They realized it wasn't coming. Back home, barely a week after James and David made their triumphant return to Fort Conger, a resupply ship called Neptune, loaded with 8 tons of food, had begun its journey toward Lady Franklin Bay. But as it pushed through the narrow stretch between Ellesmere Island and Greenland, Neptune hit a wall of towering slabs of ice, and it blocked every possible path forward. To make matters worse, just like Greely and his men, the crew aboard Neptune had no experience with these brutal Arctic conditions. And even if they had, it wouldn't have changed anything. That ice was a dead end. All Neptune could do was turn around and go with Plan B. This wasn't a shock to Greely. Before the expedition began, he and the resupply team had talked out this exact scenario. If the ship couldn't reach them, the fallback plan was to leave the supplies at a predetermined drop point, Cape Sabin, roughly 380 kilometers south of Fort Conger. So now, instead of a ship delivering life-saving cargo to their doorstep, Greely and his men would have to go get it themselves in 3 tiny boats, through treacherous, snow-choked waters, past the same ice that had just stopped Neptune dead in its tracks. But all that risk wasn't even necessary yet. They still had more than enough rations to last them for a few months. Naturally, most of the crew wasn't exactly lining up to take on that suicide mission. Greely, though, was a different story. He kept pressing the issue, threatening to launch Plan B at the first opportunity he got. The brutal winter, however, kept shutting down his chances. Still, his attitude was rubbing people the wrong way, and fast. Tensions started rising, arguments broke out. Some of the men were openly looking for ways to ignore Greely's orders, and whenever that happened, he'd snap aggressively. The expedition physician, Dr. Pavey, had his contract ended in July that year, and with the team falling apart and the conditions getting worse by the day, he refused to renew it. He told everyone he'd still do his job as a doctor, but he was done with the expedition's research. Greely didn't take that well. He demanded all of Pavey's personal journals and research notes, but he flat out refused. That just pushed Greely over the edge. He accused him of deserting the mission and threatened to have him court-martialed once they got home. With all the tension building, negative energy growing, despair, homesickness, and the creeping fear that they might actually be stranded out there in the brutal Arctic, the long, dark winter months dragged on. It was cold, it was bleak, and every day felt heavier than the last. Still, they held on to one thing, and that was hope. Hope that somehow they make it through, and that once summer rolled around and the next sailing season would begin, the rescue ship would arrive to pick them up. But what none of them saw was the real nightmare hadn't even started. The rescue team on board Proteus was supposed to head out as early as possible during the 1883 sailing season. The idea was to reach Fort Conger before the sea ice locked down the narrow stretch between Ellesmere Island and Greenland. But just like before, a mix of government apathy and an unprepared crew pushed everything back. The ship didn't leave until late June, and sure enough, within a few weeks, Proteus ran into the same heavy packed ice. Only this time, the captain figured he could push through, but he underestimated the Arctic. Proteus couldn't hold up. The pressure tore it apart, and the crew barely made it out alive. Back at Fort Conger, Greely and his crew were still waiting, completely unaware that Proteus hadn't just failed, it had sunk. Their hopeful waiting slowly turned into hopeless, soul-crushing silence. By early August, it started to sink in. Something had gone wrong again. At this point, Greely made the call. With the second resupply ship now presumed lost, he figured it was time to act on the backup plan. They'd leave Fort Conger and head south to Cape Sabin, where Neptune, followed by Proteus, were supposed to have dropped off those emergency rations. But the situation wasn't that cut and dry. The expedition had brought more than a year's worth of food, and although supplies were running low, the waters around Fort Conger still had plenty of seals to hunt. The crew figured it was safer to stay put and survive off the island rather than risk everything sailing tiny boats through waters where 2 full-size ships had already failed. Greely, though, wasn't budging. He had a plan that had been written up and agreed upon before any of this started. To him, sticking to it was the right move, even if it wasn't the most practical one. So despite growing resistance from the crew, he gave the order to leave. On August 9th, 1883, they packed up and set out for Cape Sabin. Greely was sure once they reached the cache of food left behind by Neptune, the crew would come around. They'd see his logic, appreciate the decision, and maybe even thank him. But just a week into the journey, reality started to hit hard. They were burning through coal way too fast. There was no way the steamboat could take them all the way to the supplies. That's when Greely came up with another idea. He said they should abandon the boats entirely, load themselves and their supplies onto a drifting ice floe, and hope the Arctic winds would steer them towards Cape Sabin. And that was the last straw. The crew lost it. They completely stopped listening to him. Greely tried pulling rank, throwing out threats, even said he'd shoot anyone who disobeyed, but it didn't matter. The damage was done. He'd lost control. Over the next few days, Greely started spending most of his time curled up in his sleeping bag. When he did come out, it was just to shout at people, trying to claw back some authority before retreating again when nobody paid him any attention. The crew had started leaning on First Sergeant David Bernard. He wasn't just a calming presence, he was giving out actual useful orders, trying to keep the group from falling apart completely. At one point, a few of the men even came to him, asking if he'd lead a mutiny against Greely and put an end to what they saw as reckless, self-centered leadership. But David turned them down, and the idea died right there. Then came September 10th. Almost halfway to Cape Sabin, their slow, struggling steamboats, almost out of coal, got stuck in thick, unbreakable ice, and there was no moving forward. Now they had no choice. They grabbed what supplies they had, stepped off the boat, onto an ice floe, pinning their hopes on the wind to carry them towards the resupply. 19 more days passed, drifting on the floe. Then on September 29th, after 51 days in the freezing waters, they were miraculously carried to a point just south of Cape Sabin. When the exhausted crew stepped on the land, they realized the camp was now just a day's walk away. It was the first bit of good news after weeks of struggle, but time was running out. Within a week or two, winter would fully set in, and the sun would disappear, and things would only get worse. Greely ordered the men to build a shelter like they had at Fort Conger. Surprisingly, after reaching shore, something had changed in him. He wasn't shouting and barking orders anymore. The long days on the boat and the ice had clearly made him reflect on his behavior. And then Greely was calmer, 2 men more to walk to Cape Sabin, willing to listen. He worked alongside the men to build the shelter, and suddenly, it felt like he was the only one who could lead them through this. They finished building the shelter quickly and find the supplies left behind by Neptune and Proteus. But 2 days later, the men returned with the worst news. There were no ration caches waiting for them. Instead, both the captains had left behind notes for Greely. The Neptune's note said they had only managed to leave a small portion of the supplies they brought. The Proteus had left nothing at all. The ship went down before it could drop off anything. The captain of the Proteus, however, had left behind the coordinates for 3 different supply caches they'd come across, left there by earlier expeditions. Now, counting the small cache drop off by the Neptune, Greely and his men had 4 potential supply sites they could go after. But there was a catch. 3 of them, the ones marked by the Proteus, were in the opposite direction of Neptune's, which meant they couldn't go after all of them at once. They'd have to choose one and hope it made a difference. And even if they somehow managed to get every single one of those resupplies, it still wouldn't be enough to carry them through the brutal Arctic winter. But sitting around and waiting for starvation to set in wasn't an option either, so Greely made a call. He chose to go after Neptune's cache first and figure the rest out later. To make that easier, he decided to move the whole group closer to Cape Sabin towards the north. On October 12th, with the sun about to disappear for the long Arctic night, he ordered everyone to pack up and head out. They didn't make it all the way to the Cape, but they got as far as Pim Island. It was about halfway there, close enough to reach the resupply. Combined with the scraps they already had, 40 days worth of food was nowhere near enough, and Greely knew they were looking at a full-blown crisis by early November. After that, the only choice would be to send men out again, this time all the way south through ice and snow to try and gather whatever was left at the other supply sites. That food, if they even found it, would have to last until at least April, when the weather might ease up and rescue could be possible. Or maybe they'd be able to hunt something if seals showed up. As expected, once November rolled around, the cold, the isolation, the homesickness, none of it mattered anymore. One thing took over everything else, and that was raw, desperate hunger. Greely handed off the critical task of rationing to David. Every single day, he had to measure out the tiniest portions, barely enough to cover a palm, and hand them out to a group of starving men who were anything but patient about it. Arguments broke out constantly. Fights became a part of the daily routine. The whole camp felt like it was about to snap, and the hunger only made it worse. One day, David opened a barrel of old dog biscuits and found them covered in mold. He tossed them aside, thinking they were no good, but the starving men ate them anyways. Moldy or not, at that point, food was food. Seeing where things were heading, Greely decided to send a group out again to look for the other supply sites. It was a risky move, especially with the men already starving and the weather getting worse. But they didn't have much of a choice. Greely handed the task to a group led by a photographer, George Rice, and Sergeant Joseph Ellison. Even though George wasn't from the military, he had been one of the toughest men so far. He'd helped keep spirits up, tracked down food, hunted when possible, and had shown real selflessness throughout the expedition. So if anyone was built for a dangerous mission like that, it was George. He and the team set off south, and for 5 brutal days, they'd fought through some of the harshest, most unforgiving terrain, with their bodies barely holding up, and finally found 150 pounds of dried meat left by an earlier expedition. But before they can even process the win, Sergeant Joseph collapsed from the brutal conditions. His body had taken a serious beating from the cold, and his hands and feet were numb with frostbite setting in. He was groaning in agony, screaming through the pain, and it didn't look like he was going to make it. George and his group had to make a call. Either they carry the rations back to the camp, or they carry Joseph. The men chose Joseph. But for the next couple of days, the group dragged their friend through the endless white hell of the Arctic, trying to make it back. But the journey felt like it would never end. When they were about 12 hours away, the rest of the group couldn't go any further. They stayed behind while George kept going alone, and eventually reached the camp, sending help back for the others. And while Joseph and the men were rescued, the mission to retrieve the rations had failed. Four months later, as March rolled in, the long Arctic winter was finally starting to loosen its grip, and conditions were expected to improve. But for Greely's group, things were going downhill fast. Over the past few months, they had repeatedly thought about moving to Littleton Island, across the waterway toward the Greenland side, hoping to reach the area where it was easier for the military to pick them up, but the harsh conditions never gave them a real chance. With literally just scraps of food left, the expedition members tried multiple things to somehow ease the gnawing pain of hunger. They had shot a few frozen foxes and once a polar bear, but neither of those were more than a few bites when divided among 25 starving men. They also tried netting and managed to catch quite a bit of shrimp, but those ended up causing stomach problems because of the high fat content. On top of that, the Arctic had started taking a toll on human lives as well. In January that year, the expedition suffered their first fatality. A man named William Cross died of starvation, and the rest of them weren't looking to live much longer. The worst off was Joseph. His frostbite was so bad that one of his fingers, then a foot had literally fallen off, and the rest of his limbs looked like they were next. Greely and the others had been sharing their rations with Joseph, trying whatever they could to keep him alive, but none of them really knew how long they could keep it up. Joseph, on the other hand, had developed a growing fear that his starving teammates might end up eating him, as cannibalism wasn't exactly unheard of in expeditions like this. Back home, Greely's wife had been constantly pushing the government agencies to launch a rescue mission for the stranded men, but the authorities didn't show much interest at first. She eventually took her fight to the media to put pressure on them, and that did help a little. By January that year, a plan had finally been set in motion to begin the rescue operation, but while things were just starting to pick up on one end, they were falling apart on the other. Back at the camp, people were dying. George Rice, who had been one of the strongest and most determined volunteers, had made several attempts to head out in search of Inuit settlements or any kind of food, but every effort so far had ended in failure. When the weather finally began to improve a bit in March and April, he made the decision to try again, this time to head south and retrieve the meat they had left behind when Joseph got frostbite. He prepared for the journey with another man, and the two of them were supposed to set off on sleds. But just before they left, George got the devastating news that his bunker mate had died. Shocked and heartbroken, he rushed back inside, collapsed beside the body, and just laid there for a few hours in complete grief. Eventually, he got up and went out anyways, determined to find food, without knowing that this would be the last time he left camp. Just a few hours into the journey, George started feeling exhausted and could barely move. His companion noticed and asked if they should turn back, but George insisted he was okay, and even cracked a joke just to prove he was fine. But the truth was, he wasn't. On the way to retrieve the meat, George Rice died in the arms of his partner on the evening of April 9th, 1884. His partner wasn't strong enough to carry either the meat or George's body back to camp alone, so he had no choice but to leave both behind out in the Arctic cold and return to camp empty-handed once again. In the days that followed, more and more men started dying from extreme starvation, one after another. And the ones who were still alive, terrified that death was closing in on them, began secretly cutting pieces of flesh from their dead comrades, sometimes using it as bait for netting, and other times actually eating it. On top of that, food theft had become a serious problem. Even though the remaining rations were kept under tight watch, a few break-ins had happened during the winter and were still happening. Most of them, it turned out, were the work of one man, Charles Henry. Back when they were still at Fort Conger and everyone else was struggling on minimal rations, Charles had somehow managed to gain 10 kilos, mostly because he kept overeating. And when the food situation took a turn for the worst, he just couldn't control himself with the tiny portions and kept getting caught stealing from the supplies again and again. At a time like this, stealing food wasn't just a petty crime. It was endangering the lives of others. And after several warnings, Greely made the brutal decision to have Charles executed in early June. By that point, only a handful of men were left anyways, and it felt like just a matter of days before they too would fall to a slow, painful death. With no hope in sight, the remaining survivors burned their boats to use the fire for warmth, but that ended up melting their snow huts and caused flooding. To escape the water, they set up a tent near the cemetery where the dead had been buried, and there, surrounded by graves, they waited, not for help, not for food, just for the end. But as the saying goes, life shows up when you've completely given up on it. Far away in St. John's, 4 ships, the USS Bear, USS Thetis, HMS Alert, and Loch Garry, had finally set sail on the rescue mission for Greely's team. By June 22nd, they had reached Greely's latitude, and as one of the ships were scanning the coastline, someone spotted a figure, one of the survivors, holding up a tattered pair of underwear tied to the end of a pole, waving it like a flag. Out of the 25 men who left St. John's in 1881, only 7 were still alive 3 years later. One of the survivors was Joseph Ellison. The guy had lost all of his fingers to frostbite, but thanks to extra rations given to him by the others, he somehow managed to stay alive up until the rescue. But once he was brought aboard the rescue ship and finally given food and warmth, his blood circulation increased, and so did the infections in his body. He couldn't handle the shock, and he died on the trip back. Other than the survivors, the rescue team also exhumed the bodies buried at the expedition's camp and transported them back to St. John's. But when the remains were examined more closely, flesh from several bodies had been cut away cleanly, strongly suggesting the men had fed on their dead. That unsettling discovery became the one dark shadow over what was supposed to be a heroic homecoming. For weeks, the press and public couldn't stop talking about it, and even though Greely and the other survivors denied any claims of cannibalism again and again, the evidence was too obvious to ignore. Greely's expedition would go down as one of the most brutal, drawn-out, and controversial missions in polar history. But what made it stand out even more was the range of characters that emerged from it. On one side, there were men turning to cannibalism, stealing food, losing their grip on sanity, and on the other, there were people like George Rice and David Bernard, who stood strong, selfless, and kept leading when everything else was falling apart. And then, there was Greely himself, a man who started off as a proud and self-absorbed character, but over time he changed. He began giving up parts of his own rations to help keep Joseph Ellison alive, and even told others to do the same. By the end of it all, the Greely Expedition wasn't just a story about surviving the Arctic. It was a mix of extremes, darkness, heroism, and everything in between. Pretty much like human nature, messy, conflicted, and full of both the good and the bad at the same time.